Hi, everyone. My name's Harriet, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the Architectural Association for tonight's event. It is part of this term's public programme, which is thinking about how we live, and it accompanies the exhibition upstairs called 1001 Ways of Living, which is about the pioneering social housing projects by Renée Gailhoustet. And tonight, we're delighted that Nichola, who is the director of NVBL Architects and a tutor here at the AA for Unit 15, will be sharing the research that she did as part of the Royal Academy of Arts Residency into Renée Gailhoustet in 2023. And she will also share a bit more about some of the beautiful work upstairs in the exhibition. And then Gilles will talk to us a bit about the influence and legacies of Renée, particularly for contemporary architectural practice in Europe and housing through his work at the Paris-based studio Muoto. If you enjoy tonight's event, we hope that you could join us on Tuesday, the 17th of March, when we'll be launching the book, Renée Gailhoustet, which is edited by Nichola and has a contribution from Gilles. So that will be upstairs in the exhibition from 6 p.m. So I'd like to hand over to Nichola, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Harriet. Good evening. I'm going to start really by talking about, as Harriet said, all of the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years in the practice of Renée Gailhoustet. So I just want to start with an experience. So on the 4th floor on the edges of Paris, 50 years after its conception, suspended over the streets, amongst dense foliage seeded by birds and 10-meter tall trees, this was Gailhoustet's sanctuary, her paradise, a jardin derrière, in this case, a raised country garden, ever-growing and unique. She designed and built over 1,500 different homes in her lifetime, carefully configured in ensembles of apartments and terrace gardens, which overlook and interlock one another, enabling residents to share fruit from their trees and water one another's plants. The building is a landscape. Her work is an improvised, living archive which continues to grow. So as a practice, we were awarded the Royal Academy of Arts Residency following the Royal Academy Prize given to Renée Gailhoustet in 2022. Residents, family, friends, and architects, such as Gilles, who is doing amazing projects in contemporary housing in Paris, and also academics, allowed us to discover her work. I never actually got to meet her because she died the year that I won the residency. We resided in and experienced, observed, recorded, and translated her work throughout. And this was really helped by looking and inspired by the archive of her hand drawings she left for the FRAC Val de Loire. This is a few photos from when we went there. The outcome was a lecture at the RA, so that was the first time that we shared a stage, and then an exhibition at the Royal Academy in 2024, The City as a Room, showing our records and redrawing of her work, translated key principles observed in models and drawings, and proposed new models for living, considering our current research and her work in a new context. These are a few photos of that exhibition. The monograph of her work, as Harriet said, is coming out in a few weeks. It's the first bilingual monograph to be published of her work, edited by myself, including a brilliant essay by Gilles Delalex, and published by AA Publications. It captures a moment in time, documenting a process of curating and translating her work. So yeah, come on the 17th of March. Renée Gailhoustet, if I give you a little bit of a sense of who she was, offered a visionary countermodel to the Grands Ensembles, the industrialized and standardized post-war housing. Developing the shape much of the Parisian suburbs. Removed from a profit-led system and commissioned directly by the municipality, her designs are not constrained by square meters, and Gailhoustet was able to open the brief and limited budget. An architecture that does not contain but liberates, inviting us to imagine new ways of living together as an ecosystem, to reframe our relationship with nature, the city, each other, and ourselves. Where others delivered clinical repetition, Gailhoustet insisted on generosity, individuality, and dignity. Born in Algeria in 1929, Gailhoustet is a French architect. The daughter of a newspaper editor, she was a precarious reader from a young age. She moved to Paris to study philosophy at the Sorbonne, where her professor was Gaston Bachelard, who wrote The Poetics of Space. And she received a degree in humanities. In 1952, however, driven by political conviction as an active member of the Young Communist movement, Jean-Marie Le Pen even broke her nose, it's said, during confrontations with far-right groups, and by desire to build rather than theorize, she entered les Écoles de Beaux-Arts to study architecture. And she trained in the only section that admitted women at the time, dedicating her thesis to collective housing and graduating in 1961. Gailhoustet lived and worked in her projects in Ivry, a testament to her commitments to her ideas. She worked here in the ground floor in Le Liéga. And from 1968 until her death in 2023, she lived in a rented social housing duplex apartment, a 3-bedroom unit with 4 gardens over 2 floors, paying about 800 euros a month. This was her home for over 50 years, and she reconfigured its internal plan according to the changes in her family and her personal life. Walls covered in ceramics, you can see here, paintings and drawings submerged amongst plants, using daily camping chairs in the living room, somehow as if she was in the countryside garden. And here's a 100 square meter garden amongst the rooftops in Ivry on the 4th floor. For decades, from 1963 to 1995, she remained deeply embedded in the communist suburbs of Paris, where politics, community, and architectural experimentation intertwined. Here we can see 3 of her main projects, amongst others, just on the edges of Paris, which is in the center. In 1963, barely 2 years after graduating, Gailhoustet was entrusted with Ivry-sur-Seine's redevelopment by the architect Roland Dubreuil, in whose office she was working at the time. Dubreuil had a lot of work and showed little interest in this task, so as Gailhoustet recalled at the time. So upon his resignation, she took over the task as chief architect. In 1964, she had established her own practice. For the next 20 years, Gailhoustet completed 9 major structures in Ivry-sur-Seine, simultaneously working on 2 other projects in the north of Paris at the same time. Ivry-sur-Seine, Gailhoustet worked closely and was supported very closely with Raymond Laluc, a director of the Office for Social Housing and Urbanism in Ivry-sur-Seine throughout these 20 years. Gailhoustet's proposal for Ivry-sur-Seine was a brave and daring one, an enormous orchestration of town centre renewal, stripping away the existing fabric and proposing a unique, radical urban approach. A new axis was created and parts of the roads were sunken below ground to free the streets for pedestrians, as you can see in the cross there of those 2-axis roads. Ivry is unique. There is no other town development in the world like it. Various programs animate the spaces above, including 782 homes, artist studios, kiosks, medical centers, schools, retail units, a library, offices, and a shopping center. All were superimposed one onto another and wrapped in nature with various degrees of density, complexity in the development. So the project includes 4 towers, 2 kiosks, Spinoza, which is a varied typology mixed development, Le Liéga, in which she lived and worked, as you can see here in plan, and Marat, which was her last project and the hardest one on site. And then the estate of Maladerie in Aubervilliers, which was built between 1975 and 1984, was designed in 10 phases. It took 10 years to build and is her largest project, set within 9 hectares site across a rich pedestrian landscape. She commissioned young architectural practices as collaborators to design parts of the estate. It was designed as a pioneering eco-estate, a neighborhood that could create a landscape in itself that you could walk along barefoot. Long before the term existed, this idea of an eco-estate and remained significantly cooler than its neighboring areas during the 2010 heat wave. La Maladerie fosters encounters and exchanges for over 1,000 inhabitants, with an abundance of civic spaces, a library, cultural center, a home for elderly and children's center, as well as shops, gardens, 40 artist studios, and 850 homes. And then there's Îlot 8 de la ZAC Basilique de Saint-Denis, constructed in 1985. It is a dense development in the heart of a historical northern site of Saint-Denis. Recalled as her favorite project of all to work on, she played with the verticality between the shopping center below and the housing above, with raised civic spaces and interlocking units. I call it the monster, personally, so I haven't gone there, I've gone through, which is this. But it's really a wall that sort of covers the city. Everyone is unique, according to Renée Gailhoustet. Each family is unique, so too, therefore, is each dwelling. Each apartment must be and is different, not only because each person is different, but also because true freedom of inhabiting demands a form of confrontation with architecture. And here we can see a varied amount of flats across her projects, just showing how diverse they are. And then the interiors. Just a few examples of those. At first glance, the buildings might appear complex, even chaotic, yet upon closer study, there is a simplicity and purity that underpins them, a hexagonal grid, column, slab construction, and a light cardboard partition that free the floor plan, driven by the need for affordable and efficient construction and structure, which lend themselves easily to complex geometries. You can see this in the development of her grid throughout time. This provides an infrastructure, the foundation for a dense labyrinth to grow. Entering the work for the first time, you run the risk of getting lost. And the projects are reminiscent of old town centers where addresses and parties are impossible to find, inspiring herself of Constantine and Florence, which she loved. The buildings reveals itself as a journey riddled with traps and surprises, with an uncertain outcome, a space that encourages mistakes and encounters. So Renée Gailhoustet notes that a space is only complete once inhabited, but I would argue that space is never complete, or it is complete in its incompleteness and merely evolving into something else. Her work is a testing ground, a series of models, a transition between imagination and reality, in the words of Éric Lapierre, therefore simply a phase within the evolution of the project. And the exhibition upstairs, 1001 Ways of Living by Renée Gailhoustet, focuses on Le Légat as the first project in which all of her principles flourish and where she finds her first voice truly in Ivry-sur-Seine. An overlay of the first floor of a converted 3-bedroom duplex flat in Le Légat into what used to be a home, a rectangular Georgian front members' room and bar of the AA. The exhibition is a one-to-one testing model of one of her living spaces. The space doesn't quite fit, it goes beyond the walls of the AA, and the plan appears quite distorted. The terrace, for example, clashes with the fireplace. The ceilings misalign. Yet the hanging paint creates crevices, nooks to hide in, off of the communal square of the central staircase. A terrace to sit within, a space with different orientations, a space to inhabit. Her work invites us new ways of living together as an ecosystem. Amongst the residents of her buildings, there is often a deep appreciation for the generous amount of quality of space, from substantial terraces to openings on multiple orientations, providing ample natural light and views across the gardens. She provided fluid and continuous rooms and open floor plans that exceed today's expectations and standards. But beyond providing a place to eat, sleep, and live, these spaces are places to dream in. So we wanted to show this by creating an abstract version of this space. She sees a home architecture not as a static, rigid entity, but as a living, breathing canvas, inhabited and shaped by its residents and vegetation. So by providing loggias, terraces, gardens for all units, sometimes 100 square meters in size, with 400 millimeters of fertile soil, she allows vegetation to overtake the architecture and wants to create the concrete, wants to allow the concrete to disappear. The architecture cultivates and nourishes. The architecture is a landscape, a hill, a garden, ever-changing. These contribute to naturally cooling environments, the local ecology, and the ecosystem at large. As you can see here, these are principles that we worked on in Paris and reapplied over the last couple of years that are on the show upstairs. And the square, in the study of her squares at large, we see how her work blurs the threshold. The domestic includes the neighborhood includes the landscape. She applies this collective space in different scales, in the home and in the civic space. The public and the domestic are one and the same. Dwellings face each other, residents observe or conceal themselves. The public and the domestic are one and the same. Dwellings face each other, residents observe and conceal themselves, as I just said. Open plan rooms, corridors are open, varied spaces, corners to inhabit. Spaces are not categorized, but appropriated. We can see here the extension of the entrance hall. I'll just go back, which has become the third bedroom where the husband was sleeping in before moving out. The geometry allows for a varied facade, but of multiple orientations and diverse openings. Everyone makes their own step to access their exterior space. In her own apartment, she delighted at the way that light came in from different angles at the different times of the day, a quality that she actually hadn't predicted when she was designing. For the Royal Academy exhibition in 2024, we considered how her principles might apply and be relevant in a contemporary context, considering the oddities, not only the perfection, using structural stone and sustainably sourced timber, but also allowing for a framework to be progressively inhabited, testing them in different grid systems in the scale of the tower, as we can see here. The block, and the house. Adaptation is key in her work, as we can see from her own flat altered for her daughter to move back in and live downstairs, or where walls are built in strange ways to allow for new rooms, enclosing areas outside or piling up unprogrammed spaces. The architecture embodies a way of conceiving buildings that prioritize time, improvisation, and the idea that an edifice is never built in one single act. Even though it may be delivered one day with its structure firmly grounded and its doors and windows securely fixed, as Gilles says in his essay, one imagines how it will continue to transform through a succession of adjustments shaped by its occupation over time. The majority of the housing to this day that Renée Gailhoustet built remains council-owned. And in La Maderie, for example, in the north of Paris, only 5 out of 800 units are privately owned. And despite decades of neglect and often misguided renovations, here we can see €1 insulation added to the exterior of the ceiling. And the removal of soil and paving of terraces and the addition of walls in open civic spaces. Residents still complain and continue to fight for the preservation of her work, successfully listing a number of them. So much of the social housing stock in Europe has been built with poor quality materials designed to enable fast construction and reduced to standardized typologies and frameworks for housing. Gailhoustet worked within similar constraints and challenges, choosing to standardize finishes and decorative details in exchange for diverse layouts with external space. Economically viable and forward-thinking, as mentioned by Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, one of her municipal contractors, you could say. Her work challenges this false plurality by showing us what might happen if we radically inverted the logics of uniformity and diversity that dictate the shape of today's cities. René's work contrasts with contemporary conceptions of social housing, which are based on the idea that architecture must address diverse lifestyles by offering typologies as standardized as possible, aiming at an average, an everyone, as Gilles puts this in his essay, as if there existed an average person, an average family. The problem with this conception is that the value of housing is no longer measured by its singularity, but by its conformity. Gilles writes in his essay in the upcoming book, projects are celebrated as being for everyone, when in fact they are for no one. Today, no matter how many times you move in, your apartment will always be the same. Her legacy, like her architecture, is growing as a living archive, evolving with every resident and every season. At a moment when territories and neighborhoods alike are in urgent need for renewed connection, it is conceived as an invitation to engage in dialogue at multiple scales, as introducing new encounters, spontaneous and unique. Renée Gailhoustet gives us hope that architecture can transform the worlds we live in, bringing together generosity, beauty, ecology, and inclusivity. She built an architecture and then let go. In the words of the former French Minister of Culture, Rima Abdul Malak, 1,001 ways of inhabiting our world, and perhaps, I believe, yet well still to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nichola, because for sort of opening the doors of your research, since we've been discussing for long, and maybe particularly during the writing of the essay, I guess we, you sort of opened, you let me in your reflection, since we had time to exchange on the different themes we kept for the final version, and I think that it's a good synthesis, in the end. I think the interesting thing for us was, as an office, was particularly to look at this heritage, which is very known in France, but at the same time, this little archive, very few books, very few things about her. So you may bump into one of her buildings, but we don't know that much about her. And certainly her legacy, a fair part of it is unconscious. It's there, but we haven't analyzed it, and we're not even aware of how much we've been influenced by her. Also, a lot of the gestures, the sort of values that her works carries were part of the 70s. There's a time surrounding it, so you may not look at it so carefully. So I think that was interesting for us as an office to reflect on her legacy, and that was a very interesting moment also for us, since we had been starting working with the hardcore real estate establishment, really tough real estate developers. Who, as you said, that was one point in the essay, think of this idea of social housing as a standard thing, because if you want to build for everybody, you need to aim for what will fit most of us. And of course, you do build for everybody, but you do build for no one in particular. And that's exactly the opposite position. René is claiming just the opposite. Well, I think we could discuss that. It's an open debate. I'm not sure. But these are two conflicting views, and that, of course, offers us a good critical distance when you start doing what we do, because we fortunately part of our time. But sometimes you would like to go back to where she was exactly. So I was thinking to comment 4 projects from the office that sort of make connections with her work and moments we thought, yeah, well, this may be coming from Renée, and or at least the time, the reflection of this very specific moment in the history of architecture, especially in France, with the Red Belt, where lots of social housing had been developed at the time. So the first project is simply connected to Renée because it's in Ivry. It's really her city, and this is a new development. So really totally different. Don't look at the plans. If you want to look some of Renée's ideas, you won't find it here. But this is a big building and a small urban block. So I think the first connection we thought of was this idea of the jungle, but in a very aesthetic way, I would say. This idea that plants can grow, you have among the facades, and create that very specific aesthetic of rough concrete structures and wild plants, growing all over the building. So we developed that thing, was part of a larger plan, of course, by favoring large terraces. They planted this plenty. I hope the vegetation will grow as much as it did on Renée's building. I doubt it a bit, but we did the best. You really have a thick layer of plants that will be growing. In this case, I think we maybe dealt with that special thing, that special position that she developed by trying to situate herself between architecture, urban planning, and landscaping. She really found that thing, and it's really in between. You don't know which one dominates, and probably we were in that same position while doing a big real estate development. And the idea here was basically to divide the building in a series of buildings, drawing on the typologies, and trying to extract different vocabulary. So the building looks a bit like a series of adjoining buildings all together. So in the end, we go back. If you put the facade all next to each other, you have that. It's like you unfolding the project. Looks like a small city of building sitting next to each other. We also try to provide as much exterior space, and also that roughness of the concrete, which would hopefully also get a little bit dirty with the time, and we hope time will change the building as well. So that this one is under construction. A second project I chose is related, I think, to this idea of the collectiveness, social, collective housing. What does it mean? I think most of the time the collective occurs or appears in the size of the building and collective spaces, which is a sort of representation of the collective, bigness. There's a certain scale. In this case, it's a small building. And I think it refers to Gailhoustet's idea of the collective, which you quickly mentioned as well, which is a more bottom-up vision of the collective. The collective thing does not occur by the size of anything. It just really comes from the bottom up. There's more difference. The more difference, the more details, the more exceptions, the more different people, the more unity you get, and the more collective it appears. So this is a study, actually. It wasn't built. The idea was we were working for also hardcore developer doing small houses, which are all different in terms of style, pretty much the same in terms of organization. And they said, well, we don't know how to do it in a dense urban complex. So we thought to raise this idea that every home would be slightly different, right? Still dealing with this idea we have today of rationalizing a bit space. This is not so rational because we suggested that residents could choose the destination of the space. It could be a flat or could be workshop. They could choose even the facade, and so we did a catalog as our clients did, but so they could choose their own facade. Another thing also is that these are three little towers, and the space in between the towers are terraces. They're sort of private. They belong. People can use them but they're also the main circulations. So we suggested not to distinguish what is common and what is private. So you can imagine the neighborhood will come into play. They may fight a bit. There'll be something. There'll be some debates to what belongs to who. And we thought this would be the idea of the collective, which is not like a representation, but more like a space of debate, if we put it simply. So if you see here, for instance, the way up, the stair, there's no staircase. The stair goes from terrace to terrace to the top of the building. So it's more the image of a cluster made out of very different materials that express the diversity more than the homogeneity of the resident. These were 2 housing projects. We didn't do that many. Mm-hmm. Two other projects I thought are not housing, but I think some of René's ideas do apply here. We're still about the influence, of René. This is the urban condenser. It's a campus building that hosts restaurant, collective restaurants, and sport activities. Everything is superimposed, and I think here the connection is about the determination of the structure versus the undetermination of the use. We often talk about flexibility. That's one of our big subjects today, and flexibility being linked to the absence of things, to the neutrality of space. Whereas you see that in René's work, geometries are very complex, and while she still claims to create potential for extra uses. So the idea is not even use, it's occupations. How you provide a space that has enough constraints, that has a strong architectural determination, because that determination, and architecture is quite constraining in any case, will provide freedom. So freedom does not come from neutrality, but comes from a geometrical attitude, which is here looks quite regular frame, but it's not at all, actually, and very strong, like very big beams, very thin columns, and very high spaces, very low ones, and also proportion of outdoor spaces that is really large. Actually, in this building, half is closed. Half of the spaces are indoor spaces, and half of them are outdoor spaces. So we were really aiming for, creating the most public space, but a vertical public space. So I think here the connection is really how a very constraining structure sort of strangely helps create conditions for I don't like the word appropriation, but occupation of space, and suggesting something that you haven't thought of. That's the idea. I think that's one of the strong ideas about this jungle metaphor, is that you know what you plant, you know what you do first, you know how you start, but you don't know how you end, in terms of what happens, in terms of events within a space. So I won't go much into details in this project, but that's one of our first building, but we were really drawing on a reference that were, really post Second World War architecture, and that was also pretty, strange at the beginning of it. This is the kind of space that we thought not to program, basically. Very strong physical presence of the structure, but super open program. You of course need to discuss a lot with your clients to make that such an idea acceptable. That's one image. That's one reference image that we like to show about what these constraints can create as a playful space. And the last project I chose, I think, relates to the more metaphorical aspect of this idea of the jungle. The first one was, I think, in the Ivry project, when it was really much related to, the first image that comes to our mind when we talk about Gailhoustet's architecture are the plants, the trees, the sort of countryside feeling. Sometimes you may feel you are your grandparent home, you're in holidays, and you have this idea. But there's also the idea that you may think or conceive a building not as planning a building, but as growing a building, like you would grow a garden. You would plant a few trees, then let the vegetation grow around, let it grow until it becomes slightly wild. Then you would cut, of course, a bit of branches and stuff, keep it, and adjust it. So this idea of adjustment of architecture, that architecture is a start, it's a platform, it's an infrastructure for something to come, but it's not under absolute control. I mean, this is a strange idea for us, because the idea when you're an architect, you start buildings to control everything. But I think in Gailhoustet, you can feel how much improvisation there is. There's so many details. There's no way you can draw them at first. I mean, we know that. So there's a fair amount of improvisation, and that's why I have no paper. I'm careful to be coherent.
You're really doing well.
Yeah, no, just 4 projects. But these are the trees, I'm drawing around the trees. So this is the last tree where I think it relates to René's idea of this ever-growing plan, this typical of the 70s. We know her references. She had strong relation with other architects as well, but there was this idea that the building can grow. And in this is an office project in the south of France, in Montpellier, and it was a 2-stage building, 1-stage competition, but 2-stage. So there had to be an extension in the brief, which never occurred, of course. Well, but that's the first stage, and we were thinking of how to create another stage without making a building more expensive. If you would put something on top, then you would have to make a stronger structure, which would be absurd on the first stage. So we developed that very flat plan, which will be surrounded by much higher buildings. So a very flat building with atrium, patios, because it relates to the south of France. I mean, it's really, really sunny. We chose the grid. Of course, René had more complicated, complex geometries, but we were doing office space. So the idea basically was to, I would just go to the plans. Oh, wow. Okay, the building. Okay, sorry, I followed the photos. The building is really like a block, like a big concrete block. We thought it was the very early building. Nothing, almost nothing around, and we thought that the interior would be bigger than the inside would be bigger than the outside. The building would be pretty close from the outside. Then you enter, then suddenly, poof, the space would unfold, and you had these really large atriums inside, which are the collective spaces. So the idea was just to, instead of doing this typical office spaces, there's usually a third in the middle that's pretty dark, then offices on the side. We thought to create same proportions, but put the core in the middle, and distribute 4 small office spaces. And this is a plant that can ideally grow and grow forever. So that was the idea of the building which we developed, which is just a different typology. We didn't have much reference for that except that very moment of architecture where you play with this never-ending spaces. So that's, I think, here the point with Gailhoustet. I think it's the idea that it's not so much the structure, because the structure is fairly, it's the most economical one, the cheapest one. We just got rid of all the ceilings, floors. It just, you have the basic minimum, and this the whole interior is quite different now. But we delivered as a very raw space as well. There's a few plants we told our clients, but you can put as many plants as you wish. I think it would be good together, and that's what they did. But of course, it's a bit different now. There's more enclosure than we expected, and that's the demonstration of how this geometry of this 12 by 12 square, 12 by 12, because that's where you get all natural light. Any space within this building has natural light and also natural ventilation. The ventilation, that's why that explains the big metal shutters that are perforated and the patio, so air can flow through the building, and we work with the main winds so it can be refreshed naturally. So you see with that 12 by 12 geometry, all the things you can do. And also this idea of this infinite space, you can see it sometimes through when there's no partition, you can really cross the building. And I think the last thing I could say about that relates to your Renée, is this sort of labyrinthic labyrinth idea. Yeah, I think that we find somehow this idea that you don't find the entrance. But once you find the entrance, you don't find your way nowhere. It's not, you never make it that easy, because, architecture is an experience, and you need to ask for your way. You need to ask, how do I get? So you talk to your neighbor, you talk to someone who doesn't know. And this building is very simple in its geometry, but it's super complex from the inside, because there are plenty of exceptions, of course. Every corner, every hole, every patio is different. And also, I remember being lost every time we wanted to get out of the building after, during construction site, because everything where it looked slightly the same. So it was really more than amazing. It was something we would get lost because it's so wide, actually, also, which also refers to this, pyramid-like profiles. The bottom usually used for, not for housing. Because they're so wide at the bottom. So I guess this is the last reference. And I guess as a conclusion, I wanted to thank you again, because I'm really looking forward for the book.
Me too.
I mean, I knew that book from your exhibition, which I thought was really beautiful. I hope the next one will be as beautiful. And I think it's, for me, the last idea was this ever-expanding idea of her own legacy that we discover. I mean, like, it's almost half of a century later. Mm-hmm. How much questions? I mean, the actuality of all her ideas, a critical point of view, and I don't know. I thought it was an ever-expanding building, so I thought make a connection to this idea of this ever-expanding legacy that probably will be discussed, in the future again, and we won't stop after the exhibition, I guess. So thank you again.
Thank you. Well, that was very improvised. That was great. I think we showed two very different architects straight away. I was very controlled, and in you being very improvised, which is interesting because it's obviously makes sense for the title. This idea of improvisation, but also spontaneity, as much as uniqueness and exception in her work, but also in your work. I think throughout. And maybe I wanted just to start by asking sort of how does improvisation work in your process of working? Because in Renée Gailhoustet, I think that she allowed that to happen in her studio. Like, she had about 7 sort of people working for her, a very small studio, and she would go round and let everyone sort of, very much take part in the design process by, she would give them the grid system, and they would have a section to complete and start sort of creating partitions and individual houses within that. And she would sort of overlook it, but also take the work home over the weekend and then start to question it and think, I think, about these experiences and these spaces throughout. And I wondered how maybe that works in a contemporary setting. Like, what does improvisation mean to you today?
Well, I would say it doesn't really work for us because clearly our buildings are not improvised.
Speak up a bit, please.
Sorry, maybe I'll bring the microphone. I would say we do not improvise at all. I mean, maybe in the 70s you could start something and you could see the kind of detail she was doing and how much work there would be during construction. While given today's markets and conditions, this kind of improvisation is very dangerous. You do not allow yourself. I think we kept that idea of improvisation more on the side of the becoming of the building itself after it's constructed. And it's about working with the program itself, really as a start, and then throwing the program away somehow, taking as much as a base and getting free from it, because the one thing you're sure of is that the program will be different by the moment the building will be, I would say, finished. So I think what the connection we probably make with Gailhoustet is to say that maybe a building is never fully finished. I mean, if you take Montpellier, the clients, the residents, I mean, the offices totally changed from the beginning to the end. They were not used, I mean, it's not occupied by the same people as they were supposed to be in the beginning. So it means you have to agree, you have to work on certain configurations that are both specific and not specific at the same time. It's a very work on typology. That's one connection, I would say. In certain typology allow for more, and some don't. Clearly, you have 2 types in life. In the life of architecture, it's not very clear which one, which side you are. But I think some buildings makes you free, and some don't. I would say no. And Gailhoustet has this expression of calling for improvisation also, because I thought, especially regarding the photos in your book, you have that feeling that residents continue to improvise. They take her job, they look, and their own space, their own domestic space, well, they continue, piling books and growing plants, and all the pictures from the interior are really, really interesting, and you could feel that they almost accepted and integrated the attitude she tried to bring, to raise in her own studio. So there's a slight shift from the working table to the home.
But I think that's what I think that's very much how she wanted her architecture to be. That's why I was speaking about this idea of it never being finished, because somehow I feel like she sets the stage for it, but then she doesn't really have any kind of want to control it whatsoever, and she actually wants it to completely be taken over. Like you say, there's a jungle, but she's desperate in some ways for her architecture to be hidden. Because you talk about this idea of the ambition for yours to be hidden as well in some ways, and sort of taken over and readapted, but also allowing it to sort of just letting go in so many ways, which is something that I think we don't often think about in architecture in some ways. Like, we often design for a specific brief that has to meet that. And then I guess the question being, how do we find that balance that you're talking about, that rigidity versus that fluidity of
What is a
the other
question?
lives it could
Question of
hold.
typology and materiality, I would say. Which there's an expression in French. When you finish a building, you reach a stage of perfect achievement. But achieve also in French, I mean, achever, c'est like you it means to kill.
You're done, yeah.
You kill horses. So achievement, to me, in all cases, is really killing what is going to happen. You know, I think. I mean, yeah, I think that's the connection we make. Not in the construction, but becoming of architecture. Even though it's sometimes hurtful when you see some appropriations of your architecture.
And then maybe to move on to this idea of collective, like how do you feel, I guess from the experience of sort of your projects in a contemporary setting, like how do you feel that this idea of agency and choice of the users starts to sort of take over or maybe apply an unprogrammed sense of use somehow? And how, because I mean, in Renée Gailhoustet's work, the amazing thing about it is that the residents are the ones fighting for it. They're the ones claiming in so many ways, not only kind of different sort of uses, but also really altering the spaces dramatically and, working towards listing, working towards preservation, which the councils aren't in any shape or form doing themselves. So without them, the work would be lost and it would be gone quite quickly. And I guess like this sense of collectivity, how do you feel that started to sort of?
Well, you can feel that the residents, the association of the residents, may have a point. I think they may really win because her buildings are not really easy to change. What is changing really is the way the residents use it, and I think the heaviness of her architecture make it is also a strong point. That's a view of. You may wonder how buildings age. Should it be light? Should you be able to transform it? Do you think it? Do you think things should be temporary so you can change it over time, or should you provide a very heavy structure so this doesn't move but the rest can move? And that's really an open question, I think, and there's no easy answer for that. There are different attitudes, and I would say, I mean, it's a dialectic. Probably she worked with that dialectic, and I think one aspect what made it possible for her at that time is that she was working on a very, very large scale. I would say her idea that every building, every flat apartment should be different within the building is hard to defend from my point of view. The diversity can be measured on a very urban scale, and I do believe also that at the moment, since all flats are pretty much the same, it's around 1, 2, 3 room things, and even though you want to find a new flat larger, but it's basically the same flat, same spatial qualities or problems. And the fact that she's worked on a very urban scale made her argument more understandable, made more sense, because she said, well, this flat over there is different from this one over here. And probably the fact that architecture is so segmented within the market doesn't make it possible anymore. You could say, well, in this building, flats would be in such or such way, and they will be different from this one. So you preserve a diversity of housing forms within the city, or even larger. And I think that's our difficulty today. The fact that she had certain control on an entire city made it possible for her argument to apply. We're not yet on that stage today.
Yeah, no, for sure. She had very close relationships with the municipality, working directly with them, and in a sense, clients who really advocated for this work. And and then within that, I guess a political kind of framework that allowed it to happen in that sense. So I would like to talk about the struggle, maybe, no? Like, 'cause this idea that something that's hard can provide, in some ways, that freedom that you want, because it has the kind of the framework around it. Like, maybe, you talk about I think you say, like a jungle, a space where freedom and struggle intertwine. Could you go into that a little bit more detail?
Well, if you think of the terraces, I mean, it's leaking from everywhere. Usually you want to have really sleek, flat, make small adjustment, and she does not do that. She just, you can see that she refuses to make life easier, and you can see that everywhere, both in the geometries, in the finishing, and where things are not easy to use, even the confrontation you mentioned of the neighbors, they really face to face. So nothing is easy, and I guess maybe that's one reason, strangely, that made the association possible. They sort of know each other, and I guess it's a small community, but the community is made out of not just single people. I was saying that it's really, her vision is really bottom up, but it's also about confrontation with among people, but with the architecture. I think the architecture, in her case, has to resist, and that's the condition for occupation. Because if the idea of freedom is a strange idea, because freedom does not exist by itself. You're never free. You're free of something. You resist against something, so you need something that resists. And architecture plays that role. And I think every detail nothing is every door. I don't know if you've seen the report by Simon Boudvin. He only shot doors. And these doors are not easy to deal with. It's not. Nothing is that simple. Architecture is very present, and I think it's a strong statement. And nowadays, it's not that easy to convince anybody around this idea. But that's maybe that one reason why her buildings will last as well, because they're so difficult to deal with. They have strong personalities. You can imagine Jihad has also.
Oh, yeah,
very
absolutely.
strong one.
Maybe we can open up to the floor. You have anyone has any questions?
I was just wondering if you could take us forward, if you could see a passive house version of the René's buildings, because that confronts all sorts of issues, doesn't it? The modern house, passive house, is like zero habitation there. So how can those sort of structures deal with that kind of issue? And how do you deal with massive drainage problems and massive organisational problems, like who runs the shop? If that building was abandoned, that would not be maintained at all.
Yeah.
So how does that work in France?
Well,
It's not maintained either.
no, that scale is really difficult. I think we're redoing the same. We have the kind of things I showed you at the beginning. Well, there are a few problems with René's ideas, which belong to the pragmatic aspect of the collective, and the fact that this is one single structure for everybody. Car parks are underneath, and when someone has a problem, someone else has one too. And the maintaining of this moment of architecture is problematic, because this fragmentation of typologies does not go with the fragmentation of architecture itself. And I think to me, that's one failure of this moment of architecture, which we should be able to solve. I think there are ways to solve them. I will give you an example. The first one, there's a common car park for all the buildings around. This is the most absurd thing ever. In terms of maintenance, there's going to be troubles till the end of it. If you think of this building, they won't. I believe we didn't we didn't want to do that because we're in charge. Because, for instance, here you can divide it with various entrances, so you can separate it. That's the same idea with the Saclay, the one before. We thought in the collective there are individuals, but one individual activity should not prevent the others to do what they want. So you need to integrate that. If one shuts down, goes, the other one continues to live. And I think there's a certain rigidity in that, just not Renée, but that entire idea that, this, I think, to me, the problem was they were still in a linear time. I know they still thought they were doing the best for forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the problem they have, and we will still have the same problems for many districts. I mean, at least in Paris, it's a few examples in not just Ivry, but in Boulogne, Paris, Rive Gauche, 13e, where everything is built on
On a plane.
It's actually a very modern infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. That's where it comes from. The problem. We could solve that, I would say, but politics together. You usually have to sell one finished thing, and I think we're still on this imaginary of the superstructure. You don't see it, but it's there, and that's the problem. Very pragmatic problems.
Anyone else?
Firstly, thanks very much for such an thank you. Firstly, thank you for the microphone. Secondly, thank you for both of you for such an interesting set of presentations. Really fascinating. I had two questions really about this notion of the house or the dwelling being different rather than standardized, and taking that idea of every family is different, so every dwelling should be different. And how on earth does that work in a big municipal housing office in terms of management? I'm just trying to think, if you had the GLC or Camden or whoever trying to allocate how homes to all these people when every home is different, and does that not cause huge difficulty and complexity and argument? I don't know. I would be interested in any light you could shed on that. And then secondly, in terms more formal, sort of geometrical terms, I thought it was fascinating what you showed us of the grid that from which this huge variety derived. But I would like to just hear a bit more about that, because if one thinks of other architects from that period who were doing kind of Casbah type housing like Beaufield, or what we have here in London at Odham's Walk in Covent Garden, which all looks frightfully random, but in fact is terribly tightly controlled geometrically. And I'm not clear whether Renée was doing that, whether there was that tight geometry controlling it all, or whether it was just much more random. And I'd be very interested in any light you could shed on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no. So first you were talking about sort of the allocation of the housing being all different. I think that's quite interesting, because what I understood when I was sort of doing the residency was that speaking to a lot of the people who manage the specific blocks, because they're all quite different, and Ivry is a test of that you have actually very separate housing, whereas in La Malterie is like a huge estate. So they're very differently managed in that sense. But for example, in Ivry, in Le Liéga, which is what we based the exhibition on, a lot of people don't want to live there. Like when they first come in, they're just like, I just don't understand how I'm going to allocate my furniture, where my TV's going to go, where my sofa's. They just can't quite envision themselves in those spaces. But at the same time, there's so many qualities that they're just like, well, I get so much more glazing, like so many more openings. I get so much more terraced area. The square meterage is much larger than a lot of the other social housing units that you might get. So they balance themselves out. And then once they start living there, they realize how much they like it. And actually, the residents who have been there, most of them stay like as long as they can, because one, it's very close to the city centre. Two, because it's just incredible value for what you're getting. But there is that process of sort of visiting, and they have 3 chances. So they go to one, and if they don't like it, they go to another, and then they have to take the 3rd one. But what's amazing about her architecture is that you will get more room than you would expect. So if you're, let's say, a large family, you'll probably have those 4 bedrooms, plus you'll have a corridor space where you can have another bedroom, etc. So I think that people can start to see how they can live in it in a way that would be beneficial for them long term, and how it will adapt and work with them when their family sizes are changing, when when they want to bring in new members or whatever. So there's something very very interesting about the appearance versus the kind of qualities that it gains. And just that fact of designing those 1,500 homes that are completely different is, I mean, it's so impressive for such a small studio. I mean, she remained small on purpose. So she collaborated with other architects, bringing in quite small, quite young, emerging practices in order to design blocks, so that she wouldn't have that kind of weight on her shoulders of basically providing everything for these very large areas. The other one is the grid system. Yes, she was very much enamored by Jean Renoir, so extremely influenced by him, and they were partners in life for over 10 years, and they have 2 daughters together. So she brought him into Ivry to work with her on the master plan, and in that she learned a lot from him, and you can see that, I think, in her designs. But the grid, she developed herself. So the hexagonal, the one in Liéga and the one in Maladrie are slightly different, but she very much is the only one to develop that grid. And that structure, although it looks extremely complex, is very straightforward and simple to actually build. It's essentially a concrete frame slab structure, and within that they're very light partitions, so very adaptable and interchangeable. So the facades vary hugely, and as we saw in your work, Gilles, I think you have the same plain section, but then in her case she pushes, doesn't she? She pushes that front facade in and out, and Jean Renoir pulled it out a lot more. So he has the étoile, they call it, the stars, right, in Paris, in Ivry. Whereas she kind of pushes in, and she allows for kind of these spaces to reveal themselves. So she designs from the inside, really, more than from the outside. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I would say I can add something. There's 2 things when you were talking. I was thinking there are 2 deep things that are difficult to admit today, and probably better from her personality, that conflict is part of life. Architecture is not here to please you, and you have to adapt to architecture. Architecture does not have to adapt to you, because you don't know who you're building for. And it's true that when you think of social housing, you don't know who you're bidding for.
Yeah, exactly.
People are sort of
Could
ghosts, you don't know them. Very difficult public. So the idea that you have to adapt, but this adaptation is not like you're not losing your identity, you're gaining another one, which is not so bad. So I think for her, we do evolve, and if you have this idea of the choice, the multiple choice thing is funny. I think it's quite coherent. You think you don't like this one, you go to another one. You're not happy, just go away. Find another one. Maybe you like it better. So that complies to this idea of the diversity of the places. But then conflict and adaptation.
That's similar to like how I think in your essay you see this idea of the jungle and evolving and developing. But I think in the way that I perceive it as well, it's like this idea that the home not only evolves through time of like who's using it, but it also allows you to evolve, like what you're saying, no? So the architecture and the resident themselves are kind of working together in some ways to be an evolution and a kind of a growing force. Yeah.
How much the tenants, occupants could change, what limitations they have being a social housing, and certainly something like more than 90% is not only occupied. What flexibility is she built into the flats that the occupiers can change? Because you talked about the adaptability.
So mostly it's partitions that people add throughout. So as you saw on the column with the kind of the room behind it, so people will starting to close off sections or even open them up internally. In La Madrie, for example, which is an estate at ground floor level, a lot of the artist studios, they will start to kind of create their own garden section. So what was civic space, they'll start to frame and sort of, in some ways, privatize. So there are, I think that's what's so interesting, these constant kind of reactions against what's sort of privately used, not owned, but used, and civically kind of used. Yeah, they've actually been given permission for those sections. And they're supposed to put it back exactly when they leave, and they rarely do. Hence why we have those photos of those films. They don't get a penalty, actually, surprisingly, but they do. I mean, most of the time they often just leave, wallpaper that hasn't changed over the years, or kitchens that have been left. Because what she does very well is actually not provide very generous specification. She provides a sink and very simple sanitary ware, so people will start to kind of inhabit them in the ways that they want, which means that she can keep to a low cost and provide the housing quite fast. I'm trying to think what other ways gardens change entirely. People will bring in their steps to go outside.
If the occupiers are not forced to put back to because they found the flat, that would probably open lots of opportunities. Probably make the houses much more usable, enjoyable, as well as not as costly. And the amount of waste is not something else in the sustainability area. But pity that municipalities didn't accept that the changes are done. New tenants can take on, they can change also, and then leave it as it is. That could be a living organization. It looks like it's not happening.
That they don't put it back,
similar
yeah.
Similar to tenancy laws in this country.
Yeah, but I think there's something so fascinating when you see that things are just like evolving, and that's where, once again, as an architect, like she doesn't take control of it too much. She allows things to just change and let it be somehow, and I think that's quite powerful as a message, because she lived in the building of those photos, so she would probably know and see it every day, and the fact that she was so calm about that, like, is really quite wonderful, and that she knew her neighbours, what they were doing and how they were changing things, and I think she enjoyed that. So yeah.
Hi, about the collective housing that I think you mentioned, you said about like letting the resident choose how the facade will look before it's built. So is there a possibility to allow, like, if they move out, a future tenant could change how the facade look, or or it just kind of stay that way and it just can only be like interior changes after that?
I've got no idea. We didn't go that far, I have to say.
You chose it for them.
Well, this time, yeah, we thought we'd make the exercise. It was just an idea. I would say it all comes down to economics. I would say the difference between Gailhouste's moment and today is really economics. It's just, I'm not going to go deep into how social housing was conceived and how it is today. No, social housing is not public housing. It's just different. It's just social. There's money coming in, and this is an investment. It's still a product. It's a commodity. So the question of changing your facade is okay if you have the money for it, simply. And it's okay. It's a joke. It's an easy answer, but it makes sense because I think the difference is that in Gailhoustet's moment, probably she had the price. She was the urban planner, so she knew how much money would come in. She had the control of all the process. So if you have a goal, you say this is going to cost that much, and whatever happens, I'm in control. So I'll build more. I'll do that. I know she will adjust. She probably would stick to a budget. I mean, she's probably decided of the budget at the beginning, not being bigger, but she's in charge of it and she can respect it. In today's architecture is very different. The idea is that you optimize till the end. So the only change you can do is to you change the project by reducing. So every step is about finding, optimizing it. So you have a point of reference, but you don't control it. You're not in charge of the final cost of the building, which is very strange for architects. And I guess this is true in France. This is coming. I mean, we used to have that. We control the economy, and less. And once you don't control it, it's even worse than a commodity. It's just whatever happens. And
Whatever
I guess
comes,
in the UK, you must be much further in that stage.
Back to what you were saying, I guess, about this idea that as an architect, you have to also be the landscape designer and the developer and all those things in order to find that way. Yeah.
Hello. I don't know. I was thinking about that notion of the jungle, and in the jungle you can move the trees, you can move the flowers, but even the mountains can move in the jungle. Should there be the will for it? A lot of what I do is I work in adaptation, and so the notion of like continuing the story of buildings, I think has been around a long time, and Renée's kind of digging into that. But I think there's an established history of adaptation. I wonder, would you talk to the sort of notion of skills? And about the occupiers of these buildings and the skills that they have, because often we find it's buildings are badly adapted or unable to adapt because people don't have the skills to repair a timber piece of a sash window, or there's a certain scale at which a facade panel becomes too big, and so it becomes out of reach for people to adapt their building. So yes, the finance, but two, also the sort of general de-skilling of the people who occupy the building, or building buildings that are too complex that they disempower people from adapting them, like facade systems that are filled with 3 or 4 layers of different materials. Like that's unadaptable technically and skill-wise for people occupying those buildings. And there's a simple beauty in Renée's stuff that is, it's a solid window, it's a very simple piece of glass that is at a scale that makes it adaptable, and it's the success of the scale and the skills that sort of makes that building, that makes the success of that building. I wonder, would you talk about the skills of the owners?
I think what you're saying about this idea of scale, allowing it to be adaptable, is really important, because she did see them as sort of houses, but sort of stacked vertically, similar to what you were saying now about your project, like how this idea of the developer being doing only housing and then wanting to see how it densifies vertically. They're very DIY. Like they are, I would say that there's pretty much no skill in the adaptation at all. And that's what I find makes it quite interesting somehow, because it's so makeshift. It's literally what I can find and, cover the exterior and sort of put up some random wall, in between. And so, but also her buildings are made quite cheaply, so you have this kind of basic framework that's solid, that's hard to demolish in so many ways, but actually internally it's pretty, it's pretty light. But having said that, they are very standard kind of supplies. So staircases are pretty much off the shelf. So you could go and get another one if you wanted to, I guess, if you wanted to invest in your unit that you didn't own. Or the windows are just, simple timber frame with single glazing, etc. So there's something quite acceptable somehow about it being sort of messy and unskilled. But having said that, there are a couple of associations that have set up. So Jardin à tous les étages, which set up because people don't know how to garden nowadays. So the terraces are becoming covered, and they're removing a lot of the soil, for example, which obviously is entirely removing the intention of it being thermally sane and it taking over, I think, the building as she wanted. But it looks quite dire, like as a whole. So these associations are sort of teaching people how to garden and bring back these gardens in a very easily maintainable way, for example. So yeah.
Well, I would say her architecture is not about adaptation at all. I'm not sure of your question, because I said the opposite before. I think in her position, she said we need to adapt to architecture, not the other way around. You you have different flats, so you're not happy, you go to another. That was possible in her case, that position. That's tough. It's a tough woman. Tough position. We cannot do it today.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do not have, I mean, in that kind of social housing, if someone's not happy, they say, I want a new one, and it would go, oh, well, let's look if there's another. Yeah, and you go, let's see if there's another flat that's more suited for your family with the extra kid or the teenage boy who went away. So there's an adaptability which is not literally moving walls, but about moving within the residence.
I suppose you should have a lot of choice.
Yes.
Which is less difficult to provide.
Yes.
If you have an overproduction and oversupply, and then you will have more flexibility, and when there's a huge shortage, you will end up compromising so much that they're consequently unhappy, whatever. But the variety is maybe the idea, and then flexibility and people moving around.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Gilles.
Thank you
For coming to the
Nichola.
AA for the first time. I can't believe it's your first time. And I think we're going to have drinks. Is that right? Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Harriet and Molly, always. Thank you.